Interviewers frequently decide who they're going to hire within the first few minutes of an interview, and then spend the remaining 45 minutes quietly gathering evidence to support that early call, whether or not they realize that's what's happening in the moment. This is a well-documented pattern called the primacy effect. Information that arrives first gets weighted more heavily in memory and in judgment than information that arrives later in the same encounter, even in cases where the later information is objectively more important or more diagnostic of actual job performance. A confident handshake, a strong opening answer, and a relaxed first minute of small talk can color how every single following answer gets interpreted, almost always in the candidate's favor once that early positive impression has been formed. A nervous stumble on the very first question can produce the exact same effect running in reverse, making a genuinely strong, well-reasoned answer given 20 minutes later read as a lucky recovery rather than as real underlying competence, purely because the interviewer's lens was already set by that first uncomfortable moment. The candidate's actual qualifications, knowledge, and skill haven't changed at any single point during that hour-long conversation. Only the lens the interviewer is viewing everything through has changed, and it changed almost entirely based on information gathered in the first few minutes. This single effect is a major reason why structured interviews consistently and measurably outperform casual, free-flowing interviews at actually predicting real job performance down the line, a finding that has been replicated extensively across decades of organizational psychology research. A structured interview scores each individual answer against a fixed, predetermined standard at the moment that specific answer is given, rather than letting an early first impression quietly bias how every later answer in the same conversation gets read and remembered afterward. This isn't a minor procedural preference. It directly addresses the exact mechanism behind the primacy effect by forcing evaluation to happen answer by answer in the moment instead of as one blended overall gut impression formed mostly in the first few minutes and then defended for the rest of the hour. Unstructured interviews, by contrast, give the primacy effect maximum room to operate freely because the interviewer is forming one continuous, holistic impression as the conversation flows, and that continuous impression is disproportionately anchored by whatever came first. This shows up in very specific, recognizable hiring scenarios. A candidate who happens to open with a story about a recent, highly relevant project will often get the benefit of the doubt on later, less clearly explained answers because the interviewer has already mentally filed them as strong. A candidate who happens to open more nervously, perhaps because English isn't their first language or because it's their first interview in a while after a career gap, can face an uphill battle for the rest of the conversation, even if their actual answers to harder, more diagnostic questions later on are excellent, simply because the interviewer's early impression was already set against them before those better answers ever arrived. Panel interviews with multiple interviewers don't automatically solve this either, since each individual panelist is still forming their own primacy-anchored impression independently, and then those individually biased impressions get combined into a group discussion afterward, compounding the same underlying distortion across several people rather than correcting for it. Performance reviews carry an almost identical risk, just stretched out over months instead of compressed into 1 hour. An employee who had one genuinely rocky month early in a 6-month review period can find that early rocky patch quietly coloring how a manager reads a much stronger finish later in the same period, unless the manager is deliberately and actively tracking the full period in writing as it happens, rather than trusting an overall gut feeling formed mostly from whatever came first and stuck in memory most vividly. The fix here is structural, not a matter of willpower or good intentions, because the primacy effect doesn't announce itself as bias while it's happening. It just feels like an accurate overall impression building naturally as the conversation or review period unfolds. The practical solution is scoring individual moments independently, in writing, as they happen, and only combining those independent scores into a final total at the very end of the process, instead of trusting a running impression that was already tilted by whatever arrived first and was never given a fair, separate hearing on its own merits. For interviews specifically, this means writing down a numeric or categorical score for each individual answer immediately after that answer is given. Before moving on to the next question, Rather than waiting until the end of the interview to form one overall impression from memory, for performance reviews, it means keeping a running, dated log of specific incidents and outcomes throughout the entire review period, and referring back to that actual written log when writing the final review, instead of relying on however the period happens to be remembered afterward, which will always be disproportionately shaped by whatever happened first. Score each candidate's answers independently as the interview happens, then total them up only at the very end, instead of trusting whatever impression built up along the way. The value of structured interviewing over free-flowing conversation isn't just a minor procedural preference among hiring experts, it's one of the most consistently supported findings in the entire field of personnel selection research. A large and widely cited meta-analysis by researchers Frank Schmidt and John Hunter, synthesizing decades of hiring studies across a huge range of jobs and industries, ranked structured interviews among the strongest available predictors of actual future job performance, well above unstructured conversational interviews, which ranked considerably lower specifically because they leave so much room for exactly the kind of early impression distortion the primacy effect produces. The mechanism connects to a broader family of related distortions worth knowing alongside it. Anchoring is the closely related pattern where the very first number or piece of information presented in a negotiation or estimate gets disproportionate weight in everything that follows. The same underlying tendency toward whatever arrives first, just applied to numbers instead of overall impressions. The halo effect is another close cousin, where one strong positive trait, an impressive resume line, a prestigious previous employer, a confident presentation style, quietly colors how every other unrelated trait about that same person gets perceived, making a candidate seem more competent across the board, purely because one specific attribute created a positive first impression that then bled into everything else. All three of these effects tend to cluster together in an unstructured interview, each one reinforcing the others, and each one operating below the interviewer's conscious awareness the entire time. A specific, practical countermeasure some organizations use deliberately is having a designated interviewer whose explicit job is to argue against the group's forming consensus during a hiring debrief, sometimes called the devil's advocate role, tasked specifically with re-examining the candidate's answers from the middle and end of the interview that may have been quietly discounted because an early impression, positive or negative, had already been locked in before those later answers were even given. This role isn't about being contrarian for its own sake. It's a structural correction aimed directly at the mechanism the primacy effect creates, forcing the group to actually revisit evidence it's otherwise likely to have already mentally filed away under an early verdict. There's a related, mirror image effect worth knowing too, called the recency effect, where information encountered most recently gets disproportionate weight instead of information encountered first, and it shows up specifically at the end of a long day of back-to-back interviews. An interviewer who has already seen 5 candidates that day may unconsciously weight the 6th and final candidate's performance more heavily, simply because it's freshest in memory, regardless of where that candidate actually ranked against the other 5 on substance. Scheduling and calibration matter here in a very practical, unglamorous way, spacing interviews so no single day becomes so long that recency effects start competing with primacy effects, and holding a structured group calibration session immediately afterward, while written per-answer scores are still available and fresh, rather than days later when only a vague overall impression of each candidate remains in anyone's memory. Beyond hiring specifically, the primacy effect shapes plenty of other recurring workplace moments a manager can learn to watch for once the pattern is named clearly. The first slide of a presentation disproportionately shapes how an entire pitch gets received, meaning a team that buries its strongest point on slide 9, saving it as a supposed payoff, is fighting directly against how audiences actually process and remember information, regardless of how compelling that 9th slide genuinely is on its own merits. A new employee's first few weeks on a team can quietly set a lasting impression among existing colleagues that persists long after that employee has fully found their footing, meaning a rocky, disorganized first 2 weeks, caused entirely by unclear onboarding, can shape how that person is perceived for months, even once their actual day-to-day performance has clearly stabilized and improved. A first client meeting that goes poorly because of an unrelated technical glitch or a bad connection can color how that client reads every subsequent interaction with a vendor, regardless of how smoothly every following meeting actually goes. In each of these cases, the underlying lesson is the same one this effect keeps teaching in different clothing. Whatever arrives first gets weighted more heavily than it objectively deserves, and the practical response is never to simply hope people will judge fairly on the full picture. It's building deliberate structure around whichever process is at stake, scoring interview answers independently as they happen, opening presentations with the strongest point rather than saving it, giving new hires a genuinely well-supported first 2 weeks specifically because that window will disproportionately define how they're perceived going forward, and treating a rocky first client interaction as something worth actively and visibly repairing rather than simply trusting that later good work will naturally outweigh it in the client's mind, since the evidence on how memory and judgment actually work says it usually won't, not without deliberate effort to counteract exactly the bias this video is about. There's a version of this worth naming specifically for remote and asynchronous teams, where the primacy effect operates on written communication instead of live conversation. The first message in a long Slack thread or email chain disproportionately anchors how everything that follows gets read, meaning a thread that opens with a slightly frustrated tone can color how every calm, reasonable reply further down gets interpreted, even when those later replies fully resolve the original concern. A manager reading a long back-and-forth thread for the first time, arriving only at the end, will often still be influenced by how the thread opened, because most people scroll from the top rather than starting exactly where a decision was finally reached. This means the opening line of any important written communication carries more weight than most people writing it realize in the moment, and revising that first line specifically after the rest of the message is drafted, once the writer actually knows how the message resolves, is a small habit that meaningfully reduces how much an unlucky opening sentence distorts everything that gets read after it. The single underlying principle beneath every one of these specific applications, interviews, presentations, onboarding, written threads, is the same one worth carrying forward past this video. Whatever arrives first in any sequence of information gets an unearned advantage in how it's remembered and judged, and the only reliable defense is building a structure that evaluates pieces independently before they get folded into one overall impression, rather than trusting that fairness will simply happen on its own once all the information is technically available. It's worth being honest that none of these structural fixes require a manager to become a different, more objective kind of person. They require designing the process itself so that fairness doesn't depend on any individual successfully overriding a perceptual bias in real time, which almost never actually happens no matter how self-aware someone believes themselves to be. A manager who scores answers as they happen, revisits early notes deliberately, and spaces out interviews sensibly is still just as susceptible to the primacy effect as anyone else in the room. The difference is that the structure they built catches the distortion anyway, whether or not they personally notice it happening in the moment. And that's precisely why structure consistently beats good intentions here. Intentions can't override something you don't feel happening, but a written, independent score taken at the time genuinely can, which is exactly why the strongest hiring processes lean on paperwork and timing discipline, rather than on asking interviewers to simply try harder to be fair, a request that sounds reasonable but has never once been shown to reliably work on its own, no matter how experienced or well-intentioned the interviewer happens to be. Building that discipline once, into a template every interviewer reuses for every candidate, costs a manager far less effort over time than repeatedly relitigating hiring decisions that turned out to have been shaped more by who happened to interview well in the first 5 minutes than by who was actually best suited for the role. Every hour spent designing that structure up front is an hour that pays for itself many times over, across every future interview it gets applied to, which is a genuinely rare thing to be able to say about any process improvement a manager might consider adopting. Most fixes for hiring bias require ongoing effort or additional headcount to sustain, while this one just requires deciding once to score independently and in writing, and then simply continuing to do the thing that was already the plan for every interview from that point forward. Fairness here isn't a personality trait some interviewers happen to have and others lack. It's a byproduct of the process they were handed to follow. And building that process well is squarely a manager's job, not a matter of hoping for naturally unbiased interviewers to be assigned to the panel. Build the process once, and every interviewer who follows it afterward gets the benefit of that fairness automatically, without needing to be told to try harder in the moment. A better hiring process is one of the few management investments that quietly compounds, getting more valuable with every single candidate it's ever applied to afterward, long after the small effort of setting it up in the first place has been completely forgotten by everyone involved, including, quite often, the manager who originally put it in place years earlier and has long since moved on to other priorities entirely, while the structure they built keeps quietly protecting every candidate who walks through the process after them, whether or not anyone remembers whose idea it originally was, or even that a specific decision was ever made at all to fix this in the first place. Which is honestly the best possible sign that a fix has genuinely become part of how the team simply operates now, rather than a rule anyone has to actively remember. Follow along for more of these.